The sessions are listed. First, Overcoming Self-Hate, A Mormon's Guide to Queer Identity. And that's listed as first, and we're going to go ahead and do that second. And first, we'll have a panel on living in the tension, LGBTQ inclusion in faith communities. And so the panelists will introduce themselves, and we'll go ahead and get started, and then do some Q&A after. Thank you all for coming.
See if I can make this work. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Brandan Robertson, and I'm an evangelical activist, writer, and speaker, and the executive director of Nomad Partnerships, which is an organization that works with conservative faith communities to help them move forward towards LGBT inclusion. And this session is called Living in the Tension, LGBT Inclusion in Faith Communities. Now, if you read the actual program, the description for our session got mixed up, and it said something about climate change. And so if you're here for that, you might want to leave now, because things are definitely going to get hot while we talk about LGBT inclusion. So that was my attempt at a little early morning humor. So this session is going to be a bit of a whirlwind. We have 45 minutes to talk about how and why faith communities must change their stance on LGBT inclusion. And we're going to do it from very different perspectives. First, my friend Chris Stackruck, a graduate student at Wheaton School of Theology and co-founder of Neighborly Faith, is going to give us a bit of an interfaith overview and explain to us why conservative faith communities hold the views that they do. Next, my friend Isaac Archuleta, a licensed psychotherapist and founder of the I Am Institute, is going to give you a brief psychological overview of the effects that non-affirming theology and practices have on LGBT people in faith communities. And finally, I'm going to attempt to wrap it all up by offering 5 practical considerations that every faith community should embrace as we think and respond to the growing questions of LGBT inclusion in our faith communities. But before we begin, I want to give us a brief overview as to why we're having this conversation at all. As most of us know, in June of 2015, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in favor of the legality of same-sex marriage for every state in our nation. This marked a momentous shift in the LGBT movement, but also in the religious consciousness of our nation. Those like me, who I served as the national spokesperson of an organization called Evangelicals for Marriage Equality, had been working tirelessly in faith communities to shift hearts and minds. And we saw the Supreme Court's decision as a major victory. But others, like my brothers and sisters of the Southern Baptist tradition, saw this as a momentous loss, a sign of moral degradation, and the beginning of a slippery slope towards persecution. Two sides of the same faith tradition, two radically different views, and those caught in between are the LGBT community. This isn't unique to Christianity at all. This is the case for Muslims and Jewish people and people of other faith communities as well. The divide is stark, and the public perception of faith communities has taken a major hit. The Pew Research Center recently released a number of polls to help us understand the state of faith and LGBT inclusion. For instance, Pew asked the general public which religious groups seem most unfriendly towards LGBT people in general. 84% said that Islam was unfriendly, 83% said that the LDS Church was unfriendly, 79% said that the Catholic Church was unfriendly, 73% said that evangelicals were unfriendly, and 47% said Judaism was unfriendly. Those are consistently high numbers for major faith communities in our nation. When we see numbers like that, as a religious leader, I feel compelled to find why my religion, which is ultimately supposed to be based in redemption and love, is seen as so hostile to many in the LGBT community. Pew also asked the general public, what was the number one reason why they discouraged homosexuality? And unsurprisingly, 52% said that they viewed LGBT people as morally wrong based on their religious beliefs. A number of other studies have come out over the last few years that have noted that the number one cause of LGBT youth suicide is rejection from family members based in religion. Yet, at the same time, 51% of all LGBT people identify as religious. We are living in very complex times where over half of all LGBT people identify as deeply religious, but at a time where most major religious traditions are seen as unfriendly at best or hostile towards LGBT people at worst. And in the midst of this, faith communities are having detrimental effects on LGBT people. This, my friends, is the state of the relationship between LGBT people and faith communities. As both an LGBT-identified person myself and an evangelical Christian, I know that something has to change. The way we speak and minister to and address issues of sexual minorities and gender identities needs to change. It's imperative. There are real lives on the line. That's why we must find new, innovative ways to uphold our faith traditions while also holding them in a way that would bring flourishing and abundance of life to LGBT people. And that's what we're going to try to talk about this morning. So to start off, I want to turn it over to my friend Chris Stackruck to talk about the social and psychological factors that prevent conservative people from being inclusive of LGBT people.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me in the back? If you don't laugh at my jokes, I'll know you can't. So my name is Chris Stackruck. I'm here with an organization called Neighborly Faith. Our organization doesn't specifically focus on this issue, although we do focus on the issue of evangelical bridge building, and specifically evangelicals building bridges across the religious borders that I guess we see modeled in this conference. This is a great example of that. I'm also a graduate student at Wheaton College, an evangelical school. Sorry, I see a hand. Can you hear me? Okay, great. There I study, among other things, evangelical social ethics, so this has been sort of something that I have focused upon a great deal. And so I'll just jump right in. Recently, evangelicalism has sort of inhabited the spotlight on this question of inclusion of LGBTQ persons in religious communities. Because of, say, the theological tradition of conservatism within evangelicalism, and also their traditionally literal reading of Scripture, they have, in the public sphere and elsewhere, defended a traditional, say, very conservative sexual ethic. We'll talk more about what that means. Although a multi-faith perspective would be most helpful in this space, I think, honestly, I think doing that well would be difficult for any one person. So I hope that evangelicalism can be a good case study for all of us to sort of draw principles and lines for the present challenges that exist with this question of inclusion, and also the future challenges that may come in the future. My goal here is not to defend or even describe the textual or theological reasons why a religious community would not be inclusive or would be inclusive. I think it's important to bracket that and just talk about the fact that many communities feel, because of their belief, that they cannot be inclusive. And with that bracketed, I think it is good to start to focus on some of the social and psychological factors that prevent people in conservative traditions from easily re-examining their beliefs, something that's so important to all of us, but I think sometimes it gets truncated to saying, you need to believe something differently. I think that there are steps between that and another place that we can all learn more about and become in dialogue over that will help us to work together better. I have to say, I feel that I must apologize being an evangelical, and the history, I think, of evangelicals in this issue is very, not issue, but question is very tragic, and I have to apologize for some of the violence that I know many of you have experienced in your lives over these questions, and that you've had from my religious community. I think I have to, say that I myself am a conservative evangelical, and I struggle with these questions. And I'm not here to represent that, but to apologize in some sense and say that I really think that I owe an apology on behalf of my tradition for grievances in past, present, and future. My hope is that my presentation can help to sort of give immediate steps to bringing the discussion forward in a new way, if that's helpful at all. So as I've mentioned LGBT inclusion, this concept, I want to give a definition to that because I think that there has been a consolidation of at least 4 different questions within religious, political, social, etc. spheres. These 4 are the social question, the political question, the ethical question, and the ecclesial question. The first I've defined as the social question of inclusion, and that is the question for religious people: how should we ethically treat persons who identify as LGBTQ, whether they be family, friends, or extended fellows? That is somewhere where the gravest mistakes have been made, and I think the most improvement can be made immediately, saying that religious communities have all the more reason to love very generously those who identify as LGBTQ. That's the social question. The political is the question that Brandan brought up of should faith communities support legislation to define marriage beyond just heterosexual unions. That has often been sort of merged into other questions, and I think it is another question that deserves great attention, that there has been great change on, but that we're not talking about today. I think these last 2 questions are of greatest importance to faith communities, being the ethical question, which is, should faith communities make normative, theological, or ethical value judgments upon LGBTQ orientation or homoerotic behaviors, et cetera, et cetera. And also the ecclesial question, which is, if the answer to question 3, if someone says, yes, I should, being a Mormon, evangelical, or Muslim, say that this is a wrong behavior, should that be something that causes division in my church, or should we all come together nonetheless? Those are the 2 important questions I want to talk about. So I'm going to really quickly outline some of the factors of tension that exist for people who believe that their textual traditions do not affirm LGBTQ inclusion. So once again, I want to say that we might argue over the legitimacy of that belief, but within religion, perceived reality is very much reality for people. So I want to talk about the social and psychological factors within that reality that I think can be helpful for us to be aware of. So I'm going to say very quickly 5 factors of tension. The first of these concerns theological faithfulness, the very obvious one. For many textually oriented traditions, it is very difficult for people to think in a new way about how to interpret their text. It's sad and tragic and creates pain in many ways. But I know for Protestants that denominations are defined upon the way in which they decide to read a text. So there is much pressure when a person comes to the text and says, I need to ask it a new question. Do I need to interpret it a new way? Because in a way it is redefining the way in which one confesses belief or identity. So theological faithfulness, I think, within evangelicalism is a sense of social and psychological pressure of identity just as much as it is something that people have a desire to either change or not change over. Another social factor within movements, religious movements, is that of dogmatic agreement, that many movements such as evangelicalism define themselves today along certain key issues. There's been a decline in sort of denominational affiliation within Protestantism and a rise, therefore, in sort of an eclecticism of saying that I do not call myself this, I call myself this, and these are all issues, in a sense. And if I, being a Muslim or a Jewish person or an evangelical, say that I'm going to pull just one off of that list, then in a sense, it is automatically to be ostracized from one's community because many of these issues, such as LGBTQ inclusion, have become defining markers within socially cohesive communities. There are also, this is the third factor, historically rooted fears with change within, I think, conservative Protestantism. Due to the recent decline in mainline Protestantism, numerically, we can talk about what that means. Many conservatives and fundamentalists fear that there is some sort of relationship between change in belief and decline. That is up for question and debate, but that is merely what is perceived within these communities, and that becomes a pressure. There's also a sense that people want to maintain spiritual distinctiveness, and you would call that communal holiness in spirit and religious terms. But some people, when they think about community, when they think about inclusion, it's hard for them to think about difference, because they believe that what mediates the community's relationship with the divine is its distinctive identity as a morally formed community. So this idea of difference around these questions is very difficult for some people with that sort of understanding. This is no excuse for any behaviors. It's no excuse for anything. This is merely descriptive of how people feel within, I think, many traditions. Finally, this one's the hardest one to talk about. There is a hermeneutic of suspicion within conservative religious traditions towards questions or issues that seem to be, and I use the words of others, quote, liberal or social. Because in some sense, many conservative people in any tradition will feel that changes from society are social in nature and have religion in tow. And that is something that really, I think, the rhetoric from all sides needs to change on, to re-examine this issue. And also, there needs to be bridge building in relationships so that people who are conservative, who are very pious in their religion, don't look across and say, they're not pious, those people who do something different from me. They're not religious. They're not truly believing in God, the divine, whatever it is. That comes through relationship, and already we have a step forward in how things can more easily change or dialogue can happen. Again, this describes for me evangelicalism, not everyone. There can be objections, but I hope these principles and these tensions can create a framework for us to think about this conversation when dealing with conservative religious communities. I'm going to hand it over to Isaac, who's now going to come up and talk about some of the psychological impacts that have come from this behavior on part of religious communities and come to those who identify as LGBTQ.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you. I could talk about this all day, and I find it rather impressive that you've made it out here this morning. If it was me, I might still be in bed. If I wasn't speaking, that is. I am a licensed professional counselor in Denver, Colorado. I teach at a local seminary, and my practice boomed right away. I created a niche where I work with religious parents of gay children, and so my practice is saturated with a lot of family therapy. When I have parents walk into my office for the first time and they sit on the white leather sofa in my office, I see the most intense sorrow. They are grieving. As a member of the LGBTQ community, I find it very imperative to respect the journey of religious parents. They are very faithful. They are motivated by sincere religious conviction. And as a psychotherapist, I cannot deny them the right to grieve. People ask me very often, how did you end up in psychotherapy? My parents are two religious leaders of a very, very conservative denomination. And oftentimes I would be a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 16-year-old sitting in the front pew listening to either my mom or dad speak on a Sunday morning. And oftentimes they would preach that LGBTQ people would burn in hell. And hearing my protective parents speak that message was really incredibly heavy, scary, and petrifying, I guess is the right word. Okay. Is this better? All right. Thanks. So as a child, I'm sitting in the pew internalizing this message that my soul is doomed. I want to make a distinction. For those of us in the room who believe that that's true, I want to respect that view. For those of you who believe that that is not true, I want to respect that view as well. But as a clinician, what I want to say is a child sitting in that pew is internalizing a message about themselves. And this has a lot of deleterious effects. By the time I was in middle school, I was hiding my personality. I was saying there's a sticker on my forehead, and if people see me being a feminine boy, I'm going to be beat up. In fact, someone did beat me up in a park. I was walking down the street, and someone, in fact, did throw a slushie at me. By the time I was in high school, I was drinking every weekend to the point of blackout. I was passing out in my bedroom while my parents were busy managing their religious institution. By the time I was in college, I was arrested and kicked out for public intoxication, and I probably needed to go to rehab. By the time I went to seminary for my master's degree in clinical counseling, I was a near alcoholic and I was saturated in self-disdain. I literally hated the fabric of who I am. When my sister had her first son, his name is Jackson, I remember when she brought him home for the first time. It was a Saturday morning, and I had been out all night with my friends drinking drinking enough to knock out an elephant. And I came home feeling so ashamed of who I was. And my sister handed Jackson over to me for the first time, this beautiful, pure baby wrapped in this blue blanket. And I felt so dirty, holding something so pure. It was this intense experience of shame that in some way the dirtiness of who I was would be passed on, that I would somehow muck up this innocent being in my arms. That is, in many ways, the effects of hearing subtle messages that my soul is doomed. Regardless of religious accuracy, biblical accuracy, this is the effect. So as a clinician who works with these children and families all day long, I'd like to share some of the things that I observe in my clients and children who grow up in religious institutions like I did. The first one is called introjective shame. An introjection was given to us by Freud as it's the opposite of projection. So when I'm projecting, I'm thinking something that you're thinking about me, and I'm projecting it onto you. You must think this about me. An introjection moves in the opposite direction. I'm taking something from society and I'm introjecting it onto myself. So this is how introjective shame works. We have a standard in society. That standard, I believe, is true. So according to my religious institution, this behavioral standard, this standard for self-identification is true, and I believe it. But because of who I am subpar, and I will never be able, because of who I will never be able to achieve good enough standing. I will always be subservient. Introjective shame is powerful. We have the work of Brené Brown. Guilt says, I have done something wrong. I tripped over the crack in the sidewalk. I accidentally spilled my orange juice. Shame is more static and comprehensive. My whole entire being is something wrong. So when we have someone who's internalizing the effects of introjective shame, what they are literally telling themselves on the subconscious, on the psyche level, I am something wrong and I'm never going to be good enough for the God that these people preach about. The second thing that I see is something that we call the egoic split. I like to describe it this way, like I'm a child of the 90s. I grew up in the 80s, so bear with me, okay? In the 90s, I remember walking around Villa Italia Mall in Denver, Colorado, and there were these huge balloons that people would put stuffed animals in, and these things were massive, and they were quite trendy at the time. I remember thinking in grad school about a self-concept. I understand myself this way, and I can hold all of this information in this massive sphere. But some people tell me that part of this sphere is clean and beautiful and innocent. Isaac, you're intelligent and you play the piano and you make us laugh. But people like you are going to hell. You are an issue in the church. And the sphere becomes divided. In essence, the egoic split says part of you is clean and innocent and part of you is ruined. And when we see this in the counseling world, what we call the ego split is literally a divided development. It's a compartmentalization. My church gets to see this, but my friends get to see this. I have to be this person in public, and I have to be this person, but only in secrecy. This is the very setup for depression, anxiety, cutting, extreme isolation, panic, It's also the setup for addictive behaviors, behaviors done in secrecy that plague our souls. I told myself I wouldn't do this again, and then I woke up the next morning and I found myself doing the very thing that I didn't want to do because I can only meet my innocent emotional desires in the secrecy where no one else gets to know the true me. This ego split creates a lot of havoc, and it takes me as a clinician many, many, many months to undo. This is teaching children you are worth it. All parts of you, Isaac, are valuable and clean. Repairing that ego attachment is saying, let's understand the fabric and the moving mechanisms of sexual orientation. Let's get to know what this desire is within you. Sexual orientation is always about the desire for love and connectedness. But when we tell developing children who will soon identify as LGBTQ, what we're literally saying is your development, in your development, we're going to call your desire for love and belonging ruined. And we're only going to accept the clean and beautiful parts of who you are. So if you want to be this person, go ahead and hide that for me and just show me this person. Does that make sense? The third thing that I see is something we call the illusion of control. The illusion of control is something we get out of the work of Pia Mellody. She would say that regardless of sexual orientation, when a child feels like they're in charge of maintaining their parents' emotional well-being, they have the illusion that they can control how other people feel. If dad has explosive anger, be a good boy so that he doesn't explode. If mom has depression, be happy and jovial and keep mom happy. And if I think that I'm good enough to actually accomplish those two tasks, I have the illusion that I can control someone else's behavior. The sad part that I notice when it comes to religious institutions and children in religious homes is they begin creating the perception, they have the illusion of control that they can control the divine spirit's well-being. If God sees this ruined part of me, he or she will be destroyed. I will make the divine incredibly angry. So be perfect, perform well, and make no mistakes, and shut down your innocent craving for love and connectedness. You know, I want to respect parents. Again, I want to finish up by saying one thing. When we ask, as members of the LGBTQ community, to belong, to have religious equality, we're not asking for the conservatives to sign off on a permission slip. We're not asking them to let us get away with our sin. What we're asking for is to feel valuable in relationships. If I could go back and be a 12-year-old sitting in that pew one more time, I wouldn't say, Mom and Dad, I want you to validate me. Mom and Dad, I want you to sign this permission slip to God to let me be a bisexual man. I wouldn't ask for that. What I would say, though, is, Mom and Dad, I want to know that I am powerful enough, that I'm valuable enough, that I'm precious enough for you to understand my reality and make room for me in your world. Thank you.
Well, how in the world am I supposed to follow that? That was really great, thank you both. And just to conclude, I want to take just a few minutes. And the work that I've been engaging in for the past year has been working with some of the largest evangelical churches, some of the largest faith communities, meeting with religious leaders who are really struggling to understand, what do we do to make space for the LGBT community? What do we do without, I'll say this, a number of communities that are conservative, if they move on this issue, it's costly. They lose thousands of people. I've worked with about 4 churches over the past year who, as they've come out in support of LGBT equality, they've literally lost 1,500 people. They've had to lay off half their staff. and these are evangelical churches. And if we want to see progress, we need to figure out ways to help these churches go through this process of LGBT inclusion in a way that moves the whole congregation together. Because the problem, the approach that's been so ineffective has been when religious leaders stand in the front of the congregation and say, today our church is now going to include LGBT people. But if you're in Alabama and you're standing up and declaring this to 5,000 people on a Sunday morning who have not gone through this journey together and who probably don't know that they know any LGBT people, you're going to scare half of your congregation away. And yet, I think it's imperative that all these congregations begin having these conversations, because this issue isn't an issue. These are real people, and they exist in every religious community, and we need to find ways to help make our communities safe spaces, both for those who are wrestling with their theology and with the LGBT people that are sitting underneath what is toxic theology and in non-affirming environments. And so I just have 5 practical pointers that I give to churches as I've worked with them over the past year. And the first, and I think probably the most important standard that we need to have as we enter into these conversations is to understand that comprehension begins with conversation. We must have safe spaces in our faith communities where two-way conversation can happen. This means it needs to be safe for our LGBT people to come to their pastors and leaders and say, this is what we feel when we sit in this congregation. This is what we feel when we're excluded from leadership. This is what we feel when we're not allowed to participate in the life of the church. But likewise, this means also that LGBT people who are in these faith communities need to have a safe space for the pastors to share their struggles as well. And this is hard for us to understand. Me as an LGBT person who sat under religious institutions, almost getting kicked out of my Bible college 6 times because of my work for LGBT inclusion, I understand how difficult it can be to stand in a space where a religious environment doesn't affirm me for who I am. And yet I also understand that if I'm not willing to engage in conversation, if I just shut down and walk out and say this community is not worth it anymore, then there is no progress, there is no change, there is no transformation. And so in order to begin true change in any community, there needs to be two-way safe conversation where a religious leader can tell me, Brandon, I think that if I give up my belief on this issue, I'm going to go to hell, or I'll be leading thousands of people to hell. And I need to hear that and feel that because I used to believe that. Likewise, a conservative pastor needs to hear, when I hear you say that my sexuality is an abomination, that leads me to self-hatred and even suicidal ideation and thoughts and feelings. And so, we need to move from a place where we see each other as others to where we see each other as brothers and sisters. We need to enter in with a true spirit of humility, being willing to learn, and this is the hard part for faith leaders, being willing to repent of the sin and harm that we've done to the LGBT community for generations. The second important point when we want to see change in communities, we need to have all faith leaders of every tradition agree that if we're doing something that's harming people, it needs to stop. One of the first principles that I've learned in psychotherapy is refuse to do harm. Faith communities must be committed to say, if there's been anything that we are doing that has been proven to harm people, we need to stop it no matter what. So this means things like reparative therapy, conversion therapy, healing prayer therapy, all of which I've had experiences with personally. We need to have faith communities be willing and bold enough to stand up and say, this doesn't work. This only harms people. And so even if I still believe that the Bible condemns same-sex relationships, we need to do this in a way that doesn't harm other people. I believe that it is possible for churches to hold traditional theological positions and yet not harm LGBT people. There are churches that do this, that might not be able to comprehend what the 6 Bible passages say, not be able to see that from a different perspective, but they stand and create safe spaces and allow for disagreement and for conversation and for LGBT people to struggle with their faith openly and for the faith community to struggle with the presence of LGBT people openly. Religious leaders need to refuse to do harm. And if this requirement isn't met, we cannot expect the LGBT community to stay in our congregations. In fact, as somebody who consults also with LGBT individuals and organizations, I would tell them not to stay in a congregation where a pastor or leader is telling them they need to go through reparative therapy, which has been condemned as illegal in a number of states and outrightly rejected by the American Psychological Association. The third point, I would say, is that we must, no matter where we stand, incorporate LGBT people into the life of every faith community. If there's going to be any progress and any change, it's not going to come through theological debate. It's not going to come through political debate. It will only come through doing life with LGBT people of your faith tradition. The thing that changes hearts and minds is when people see me. For instance, I grew up in a faith community of about 6,000 people, and I was kind of the up-and-coming golden child. I was going to be the pastor. Everybody loved and affirmed me. And then I came out as queer. Well, this community had walked with me for years. They knew that I loved God. They knew I was faithful. They knew I wasn't capitulating to culture. And what this did was it caused an internal clashing for them. Because here's Brandon, this faithful young boy who they thought was going to be the next pastor of the church, who's now identifying as queer. And in their theological paradigm, that didn't work. That's impossible. You cannot be queer and Christian. And yet, here I was. And they knew me. And what that did was, for all of these people in this conservative community, for the people that surrounded me, they had to really begin thinking, well, maybe my theological paradigm might actually be wrong. And I honestly believe in every faith community I've been a part of and worked with, anyone, like I said, that stands up at a pulpit on a Sunday and kind of tries to teach the congregation that they're changing the traditional view of their faith tradition, that doesn't work. That causes people to walk out the door. But what does change hearts and minds is when people experience LGBT people who are part of the Jewish tradition and part of the Muslim tradition and part of the Christian tradition, that live faithfully as such, and yet live openly, happy, whole lives as LGBT people. And so if you want to see change in your community, LGBT people need to be elevated to all positions within the community. So I advocate for even conservative churches to allow LGBT people to lead small groups and be involved in worship planning. And it's not, you don't identify these people as LGBT people, you identify them as people. And as they do life in your community, and you begin to know them as people, and find out that they might have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, then that internal clash begins to happen. And that's where true transformation changes. The fourth point, as I scroll to it, is, and I just touched on this a bit, we must cease to identify people based on their sexuality, but rather instead viewing them as people. I think the number one problem within conservative faith communities is that we see LGBT people as sex acts. We're so involved in the sex life of the LGBT people without seeing them as the people that they are. But most of my life isn't sex. Most of my life is living and being as a person who's trying, as a Christian, to faithfully follow my God and do life in the most abundant way I know how. And so when we reduce LGBT people to a sex act, it's easy to write them off. But what that is, it's a highly reductionistic view of a person. It's dehumanizing. And that actually will do more harm to an LGBT person than conservative faith communities could even imagine. And so when we talk and identify with LGBT people, I would advocate for all faith leaders to actually take time to actually get to know them as people, know what their lives look like, know that we don't have secret rituals that we do, get rid of all the taboo, and see us as people. The fifth point, actually I have six. The fifth point is that faith communities must be willing to reform. I think this is a point that scares some people. But I think it could be easily said that no faith community represented in this room has not undergone significant reformation since it was founded. As much as we'd like to say our faith communities have been faithfully stagnant since the founder established it, the truth is that if we're sitting in this room, the likelihood is that our faith communities have undergone significant shifts. And as a Protestant Christian, we have, out of the Reformation, a battle cry came, and it was reformed and always reforming. And I think that is a standard for all faith communities. As an evangelical Christian, I understand that the 6 passages from the Old Testament and New Testament pretty clearly, if you read them pretty clearly on the surface, condemn same-sex relationships. I also understand that much of the Old Testament upholds slavery and advocates for patriarchal societies and says that we shouldn't wear clothing with mixed fibers or eat shellfish. Most of us, most of the Christians that I know, do that. We've reformed. We've figured out new ways to adapt to change. And I think it's based in a principle that the divine is always speaking. God's Spirit has not ceased to speak in any of our world's traditions. God is calling us forward to a more inclusive, expansive vision of what in the Christian tradition we call the kingdom of God. And I believe if we are going to see our world find reconciliation and hope and healing, we as faith leaders and faithful must be willing to sacrifice some of our tradition for the good of the people that surround us in our communities and culture and world. And with that, I'll say my last point. We all must be willing to make substantial sacrifices for the good of each other. This is core to every faith tradition. This is absolutely core to Christianity. In order to be willing to accept one another as LGBT people that have been harmed by faith communities and as faith communities that are desperately trying to be faithful to the traditional teachings of our faith, we must be willing to make sacrifices. Compromise is essential in this journey. This self-sacrificial love is the heart of every tradition. And unless we are willing to give grace, refuse to do harm, listen to the actual stories, empathize with the actual perspectives and struggles of each other, there will never be any hope for substantial change. This journey is a hard journey. I stand here in the midst of 2 of the craziest worlds. I'm an LGBT-identified person and an evangelical Christian. I experience this each and every day. I experience this in the pastors I work with and the churches I go to. And what I've had to come to terms with is this. I love my tradition, and I want to see my tradition become all that it's meant to be. And in order to do that, I have to stand as an LGBT person under the weight of people that might not understand me, that have been taught their entire lives that the way I live my life is sinful. And I need to work with them and empathize with them. And likewise, the evangelical pastors I work with have needed to learn to sit with me in their office and to sit with the LGBT people that I know in their office and hear their stories and hear their struggles and not uplift the value of their theology above the real incarnated people sitting in front of them. And when they do that, and when both of us come together and make that sacrifice together, I've seen faith communities transformed. And that doesn't always mean the faith communities become the biggest advocate for LGBT equality, but it does mean that the faith community becomes a safe and vibrant place for all people to work through their beliefs and struggles around these issues together. And so with that, I want to thank you all for being with us this morning and hearing these varying perspectives. And I want to encourage you, if you have questions or comments afterwards, all 3 of our organizations are doing really significant work in these areas, and we'd love to be resources to you. And so we'll be in the back with our business cards and everything else. We'd love to meet all of you. Thank you guys so much. Bless you.
Thank you all for sharing your stories and for the work you do and for what you've shared with us this morning. I'm going to open it to questions. And so I see a hand up. If, I don't have a mic to hand out. So if you can be loud, if you can't, come up, and then I can maybe repeat the question, because I don't think these go very far. So go ahead, sir. Sure, if that would be okay. Thank you.
This is specifically to Brandon. I really, really appreciate what you're doing, living in that tension. I know that must be very challenging from day to day. And I also really appreciate what you were saying about trying to get the conversations going with these different denominations, different faith groups. But I also want to acknowledge that there are many churches, denominations, faith groups that are trying to have this conversation, and leaders will just say no. Yeah. We're not going to. This is where what we believe. This is our tradition. No. Your story very much resonates with friends and family I have in one particular Christian denomination. You even used the word golden boy. I have a friend who, same thing, golden child, was going to be of the denomination, came out as gay, yeah. Done. This denomination, they keep trying to have the conversation, Yeah. Very recently sent out an email to the pastors saying, essentially, you need to stand behind this position or leave. Yeah. So is there a point at which a community of churches, a denomination, needs to go through a death and rebirth? Yeah. Yeah. And there just needs to be like, yeah. Sure. I know it's kind of a long question,
good. But I would just say thank you for that. And I'm glad you bring that up, because it's easy to sound very optimistic up here. But in reality, I've sat down with leaders of a number of denominations and churches, and no matter how much conversation we have the best personal relationship. I don't know if you know these conservative leaders, but some of these leaders, if I gave you their names, you'd be so surprised that they would have a meeting with an LGBT person. And we have great relationships, but they are not willing, no matter what, to shift their theology. And a lot of that has to do with they have constituencies and money and livelihood and a legacy built on this tradition, and they're not willing to sacrifice that, which is a problem and probably inconsistent with our faith traditions. Nonetheless, I think two things need to happen. One denomination I'm working with, and I hope I don't step on any toes right now, is the United Methodist Church. They face a stark divide because they're a global church, and half the church that's around the world is not willing to talk about LGBT issues, and many in America are. And the reality is, I think that denomination's going to have to divide. Because there does come a point when some of these in other countries where the denomination is advocating things for like death and imprisonment to LGBT people, there does come a point where we need to say we cannot do that harm, we cannot be affiliated with that harm, and we need to split. And so that death needs to happen. Now with that, I would still say, I would advocate for people to continue in conversation. So even if that split happens, it would be my hope and my prayer that the United Methodist Church would continue to reach out to those other people in in the split denomination and work with them to help create and foster understanding. But it's absolutely true that there are some communities, some traditions where you just need to leave because there is no movement. And a lot of that is based, like I said, on money and family and fame and legacy. And that stuff, as Jesus said, is quite toxic. And it's hard to move people who think that their whole livelihood and legacy is built on opposing LGBT people. You're not going to move them. And so there are some situations, yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you all. It was wonderful. I, too, am a member of the LGBT community, and but first, I'm a black woman. And so, Brandon, I really appreciated everything you said because I can take out LGBT and put in any race, any denomination, and it's just beautiful. So thank you for that template. I'm wondering, and this is for all of you, you're very young, in my opinion, and and what I'm seeing is I'm seeing 2 or 3 generations dying off. And as they die off, I'm seeing more of a willingness for people to discuss this issue and for minds to open and hearts to expand. I'm also seeing more young people who are saying, you know, I grew up in this faith tradition, very conservative, but that's not what I'm feeling. So I'm wondering if you see a paradigm shift happening, and if you can foresee maybe in the next 20 or 30 years more of a likelihood, if you will, of people saying, okay, we want to sit down, we want to change our thinking, and we want to work with you and accept you.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'll say 2 things real quick, and then I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. One, I would never say this publicly, but I'm about to say it publicly. In private conversations, what you just said is absolutely true. There is a point where some people are refusing to change, and the mentality is those denominational leaders just have to die off. And with that, I want to say, though, because that can be taken very disrespectfully to other generations, I have seen tremendous shifts. For instance, I do a blog that I write a lot about these issues, and a majority of my readers aren't millennials. They're people 50, 60, 70 who've been in faith traditions and just are tired of seeing these communities oppress people. And so we're seeing just as big of a shift among other generations as we are millennial generations. I think we can say that pretty confidently. The other thing, we were going to give another talk here. I do a whole presentation on the 5 marks of the millennial generation. There is a major shift happening. It's a spiritual shift happening, and I think it's global, a shift in consciousness. And we are going to see, I think in the next decade or so, as a new generation takes leadership, we're going to see faith communities that are more open to embracing diversity within the community itself. And that's one of the key marks, I think, of millennial spirituality, is being willing to have multiple perspectives exist in one place and not see that as a problem. Whereas traditional faith communities today tend to be pretty binary. You have to be this or that. Millennials are rejecting that binary paradigm and embracing what I call an integral paradigm. And so I agree completely with you, and I think the future is pretty bright for us.
We'll get to the other questions, but I just want to respond to that first question. As recent as 5 years ago when I started my practice, the timbre that I was hearing, the overtones from my clients and their parents, was very hopeless and wrought with sorrow and despair. What I hear now in some of the initial intakes that I do is I hear a lot more hope. There's a lot less shame saturating people who walk into my office. And I think what I'm seeing and what I love about this conference and the people represented here, I believe that what we're discovering and what we're all kind of cluing into is this idea that when we take away, I'm a Hispanic male, but when we take away race and gender and this physical body, what we're all left with is this emotional being. And we all function the same way. We're all beginning to learn that my version of love is no different than your version of love, that my sorrow is no different than your sorrow, that your desire to belong is no different than my desire to belong. And I think that the younger generations, because of the struggles that we're facing culturally with Black Lives Matter and Ferguson and you know, wars over coal in Eastern Europe, I think we're beginning to see, and I hope that this is what's happening in the millennial generation, is that we're seeing each other as emotional beings, not as people trapped in these bodies with certain color. Now color matters, and that's a whole different talk. But just within the last 5 years, I think that shift, the shift that I'm seeing is a deconstruction of shame, because we're all finding equality as emotional beings. In the next 20 to 30 years, if I could pray, I would hope that we continue to meet each other on that emotional plane, not out of the binary mentality.
Does this microphone work? Can you hear me? I guess I'm here as maybe the more conservative voice, and I know it's not the voice that is like to be heard, that people like to hear. And I'm not here to convince or to, I just sort of want to say, almost give a perspective on maybe these questions from maybe my experience and study of evangelicalism specifically, or conservative communities in general. Many of these communities, even though they take seriously the stories of others and the experiences and even a sense of a new worldview that's coming up through this new millennial generation, these communities still live around a text in some ways, and we can argue the details, and they are being argued, of what those texts are saying. But I see, as I look to the future, that these traditions will continue, probably, to live around these texts and to form themselves as ethical communities based upon their personal views in such ways. This may be reason for division. I think it's an opportunity for charity as a new wave of, I think, plural thinking and cooperation is coming in. I disagree on, I guess, the point that communities need to change in certain ways. I think communities, conservative ones, need to figure out how to get their act together and how they speak and love. But I don't know personally if their dogmatic positions on what is right should change. That's my belief. And even though I'm not here to sort of put that on you, I think it represents sort of the reality of many, many religious people.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, I think if you have a question, maybe if you all want to wait in the front row, and then since you're so generously close, we'll go. And if those of you who have questions, come up. And then, so kindly, I'm going to say that if we can get the questions just succinct and to the point. We didn't have the other session, which is great that we can fill this out with what was gone over here, but then we're going to start running short on time. So if we want to get to all the questions, just straight and to the point, and then I would appreciate it. Thanks.
First off, thank you for everything you're doing. It's amazing. And to get to the question, some context. I'm Catholic and gay, and I know how I've responded to the question, or kind of a statement that, and it's kind of unique to Catholicism, but I've been told, well, why don't you just become an Episcopal? You don't have to be Catholic and gay. You can join them. I know how I respond, but how do you respond when people tell you that there are accepting communities that do marry same-gender couples that are not queer-phobic, but are basically told to change traditions?
I hear that all the time. Thank you for that. I think the key is this, for me. I'm an evangelical Christian. This is the tradition that I experience God through. This is how I come to know God. This is how I view the world. And I'm very committed to this tradition. And I'll be damned if my tradition says I can't be a part of the tradition because I'm LGBT. Because I know through the history of my tradition as a Reformed tradition, we've seen changes and people have been included and new perspectives have been embraced. And so I think it's so important and so noble of you to be willing to stand in your community and not just go to a community that's already accepting, because here's the reality. The Catholic Church is one of the largest churches in the world. The Evangelical Church is one of the largest churches in the country. If we are not willing to stay within our tradition and embrace what is authentic to us and work for change, then we're still going to leave a majority of our population with a perspective without having the experience of LGBT people in their midst. They're not going to change their mind. They're not going to change the way they view us or these issues. So I think it's imperative that we stay there to create change, but also because this is what my soul resonates with. I'm an evangelical, you're a Catholic. I think we should stay, and I think it would be inauthentic. I've tried other traditions. It just doesn't work for me. And I think that's reflective of the infinite God that we're made in the image of. We each have a unique expression of faith that is authentic to us, and we should embrace that and not have to be excluded because of our sexuality. So I'd say that.
I think in the American Psychiatric and Psychological Associations, we have ethical standards, and one of them is that as clinicians, we have to respect sexual identity, sexual orientation, and religious beliefs. And I've internalized that as a bisexual, Hispanic, evangelical Christian. That is my makeup. And when I see people like you, Glenn, who identify as Catholic and part of the LGBTQ community, and when I encourage clients like myself who are in my office to stay rooted, what I'm asking them to do is advocate for not change, but an expanded view of love. That this isn't about saying to your priest or to your minister, you have to change your theology, but it's can you understand an expanded view of love, the version of love that I come with, and if we stay in our denominations, one, because I'm always aware of the mental health of us, I want to say, is that community safe? And if it is, are they willing to watch the definition of love be expanded by your presence? And if they're willing to do that, and it's safe, and it's a place where your spiritual formation continues to merge forward, teach love. Teach love, because that's what this is all about.
Really quickly, I love what you said about expanding the definition of love, because I think if I am to offer, say, from a I love what he said about expanding a definition of love, because from a conservative point of view, I would recommend that the best way to engage with my type of people is to engage theologically, to not sort of bring in other sources for arguing that a theological tradition should change, but go deeply and say, where are the resources in our tradition that can work for change? I'm saying that I think that is the best route to take. You had a good point.
Good morning. I've noticed throughout your presentation that you've been using, well, I have two things. I've noticed throughout your presentation you've been using the acronym LGBT, but I've only heard you speaking about sexuality and sexual orientation. And I wanted to know more about your thoughts on the inclusion of gender identity and transgender people in faith communities. And the other thing, you talked a lot about, people are people and, love, regardless of LGBT identity. And I want to know what you would say to the critique that the people are people regardless argument acts as an apologetic identity erasing strategy. Thank you.
To the first point, I would say you're absolutely right. That's a glaring omission, and the reason is I, as a young LGBT person, have not done the work to understand gender identity and the complexities of that. I've surrounded myself. I have a number of mentors in the trans community and who are working on gender studies that I'm trying to learn from, but I don't want to pretend to be able to stand up because that's not my experience, so I don't want to speak to that. And I'm not sure how to answer the second question, honestly. I'll say that. Do you have any thoughts?
Sure. I love the idea that, and this comes from my evangelical background, but that we are all created in the image of God. We call this the Imago Dei, the image of God. And as a seminary professor, I was teaching and talking to the class about trans people. And as counselors, how do we treat and work with and sit with and listen when we have a trans person in our office? And out of this bravado, this young seminary student who wanted to make a point for God's kingdom, he said, Isaac, do we change? And he was advocating that transgendered people should stay in the body they were born in. And he said, do we change the body to match the soul, or do we change the soul to match the body? And at that moment, something clicked, and he just kind of, sinked back in his chair. This is a whole semester, I could talk all day here to answer your question, but one of the things that I would like to say is, again, if our essence is God within us. How do we change the soul to match the body? That seems incredibly counterintuitive to me. I'm not necessarily a theologian, so I don't know if I can answer the second part of your question. Do you?
I want to offer an apology because I don't think there are the resources being produced in my tradition to answer your question well. And I think that, in a way, causes violence towards people, anyone who would identify with such questions personally. And it's really something we need to work on, that I need to work on. I'm no leader in a church, but I think I'm amongst the people that think about these questions, and I wish they were thinking about them more.
So I'm kind of glad I can follow up the question on transgender, because my question is, I feel somewhat similar, because within LGBTQ, you've got the A plus, and it keeps going, and there's the argument, well, what does the A stand for now? Does it stand for ally, or can asexuals claim that? And being on the asexual spectrum myself, I have a struggle with identity and acceptance within both worlds. There are a lot of people in the LGBTQ plus community who will say, well, and it's the stigma that bisexuals have to live with, oh, well, you can pass. And it's like, well, no, okay, bisexuals will make the claim, no, we can't pass, and I understand that, but asexuals can definitely pass, because, God, if you don't want to get married, then that's fine. But when you belong to a denomination that is so focused on family, I identify as Mormon, but that I understand that there are Protestant denominations that are also very heavily invested in family. It's not enough to just say, oh, well, I can live a single life and never... I still want a relationship of some kind. I still want to be accepted for whatever relationship I do have in my life. And I want to be able to feel as though I can be included in the my faith's concept of heaven without feeling like I have to pass as a straight person and live as a straight person and do the things a straight person would do that I may not necessarily agree with. For myself. And so I think that's something that needs to be addressed on both sides, is where do we find acceptance for asexuality, and how do we also find acceptance for asexuality and faith in the LGBT community? And I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to that.
I would like to start off by saying, again, this is about an expanded version of love. We have to expand the way that we talk about and think about love. We don't need to have sex for love to be perfected. We don't. And if we could begin in our religious institutions talking about that expanded version of love, we give back one another our own humanity. To say that as an asexual person, your version of love is just as profound and just as beautiful when you manifest it in the way that provokes it from your own body and makes it live within your own spirit, that is perfected for you. And in our our expanded definition of what is love, go get it. Go get that if that's what evokes that connectedness to your other and to the divine spirit.
And I just want to say, not as an excuse, but what these two questions in particular bring up is the fact that this shift in thinking and understanding both at like a psychological level and at a theological level around sexuality, gender identity is so new, and it's happened so quickly, and faith communities always tend to be a couple decades behind anyways, that there is just, and this is the conversations I've had, sat in rooms with just transgender pastors and LGBT Christians, and it's just this sense of struggle because we don't have the resources to understand or speak theologically, let alone psychologically or any other way. We don't have the language to understand and communicate the way that we need to. And I think that's where I would say, what Isaac just said, we need people to live your unique, God-given, image of God reflecting sexuality and gender identity in these communities, so that we're forced to say, okay, I know this person, I know that you're a faithful LDS person, and you're asexual. What does that mean? And we need to figure out, we need to force ourselves to understand how to talk about this in a new way. We just need to keep provoking our communities to get up to date with this, but also we need to understand that even the broader secular conversation is just learning how to speak intelligently about these issues. So I just wanted to lay that out there.
Very briefly, I want to follow up and affirm Brandon's point that these are new questions. If you go to a conference, AAR, or the Evangelical Theological Society, you'll see half the papers are about issues like this, but there is no old school, there's no tradition for thinking about this. And religious communities are rooted in tradition, and they have grave interest in preserving what is most important in that tradition. And so when new questions arise, it takes time, but unfortunately what happens to those with the questions is they're asked to wait, and I don't know what to do about that.
I thought somebody a little older should get up. Kidding. Anyway, I want to honor you for the work you're doing. And there are some great resources out there. If you go on NGLTF, Welcoming Resources, there's a fantastic guide called Trans Awareness on there that talks about gender. I think the LGBT community for years, and I've been a part of this community, we're kind of like we're the gender nonconformers, and kind of everybody that doesn't conform to normal gender roles, we kind of get grouped into this pot of LGBTQIA. But what I'd like to say is I grew up atheist, agnostic in the Deep South, which is something that doesn't happen in Mississippi. Yeah. But my father thought Christians were all hypocrites, which sadly enough we are, right? That's kind of life. We say one thing and do another. But I had my rebirth when I moved to Chicago in a Missouri Synod Lutheran church that was charismatic. Anybody know Missouri Synod Lutheran folks? Okay. Charismatic. So I went into that tradition, went to seminary, became a campus pastor, was out in that tradition, but had to be celibate, which is interesting. So, I kind of moved forward, and I kind of got to the top of the feeding chain and ended up in Siberia, Russia, doing mission work. And bringing university students over, English as a second language, fantastic work. But I came back to the States and I asked the bishop, I said, so if I don't want to do campus ministry anymore, where can I go? He said, sadly, nowhere. And recommended therapy, recommended all sorts of things. So eventually I stepped out and became an activist, ran an aid service organization, became executive director in LGBT Center in Milwaukee, and took Wisconsin through the battle on civil unions and gay marriage, which we failed miserably, but we still educated. But I think what my struggle is a bit, and I don't know if this is a question or a statement, is right now I'm doing a lot of organizing in Phoenix. I just recently moved to Phoenix, and we're organizing kind of interfaith discussions with young adults, 21-year-old and up. And we're doing it in bars and a variety of places. And I'm finding that we have some evangelical folks show up, but they don't come back because it's too hard to be in the conversation with Sikhs, atheists, Buddhists, LGBT folks. They want to be part of the conversation, but they can't. So, and these are younger people. So I guess part of it is I'm concerned, how do we move forward as a community? And I honor the work you're doing. And we're organizing also with some Southern Baptist folks. We want to do a marriage, so we want to do a statewide Arizona statement of protection for LGBT folks, right? And the Southern Baptists are giving us a lot of pushback, and specifically the pushback is around businesses. Right. And around serving, and even around housing. Many of them said we wouldn't want to offer housing to LGBT individuals. So I find it really an interesting dialogue. I'm not sure if this is a question, but I'm curious how you navigate that, and I honor you for doing that. Yeah. And I'm now UCC, I'm a pastor in a UCC church, which is United Church of Christ, which we've been ordaining LGBT folks for a long time. I've got trans members in leadership, so I'd just be curious, how...
First, I'm working with a couple evangelical churches in Arizona
you are?
to do some work. So I'd love to connect with you about that. But two,
I'm stuck.
I think the thing is, some traditions aren't necessarily good with engaging in pluralistic conversations, and the evangelical tradition, that is not our strong point. And so the way I've been able to navigate it is I still can look very evangelical, and if you don't know anything about my sexuality, I can enter into an evangelical space. I have a degree from Moody Bible Institute. I mean, I pass with all the credentials. And so I can enter into an evangelical space, talk as an evangelical to evangelicals. That makes it easier because it makes them safe and comfortable. I think that's probably going to be the case with a number of very conservative traditions. Probably the Missouri Synod is not going to be comfortable coming to an interfaith conversation on LGBT issues. And so that's why we need to identify and I think support people that are doing work as part of those communities, in those communities. There's some great, there's a number of people here in Utah doing work in the LDS Church, and I think we need to get behind them because they're living as faithful members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and working within the system, and they're the only ones who can actually create the change. And so I'd say that would be my response to that. Yeah, totally, let's do it.
Good morning and thank you. I'm Jackie, I'm older than I look, 45, and it still gives me pleasure to say out loud that I'm a lesbian Baptist minister in Chicago. Yes. Thank you for modeling a very heart-centered and clear-thinking conversation, an intra-faith conversation. Right. And I certainly hope that our friends here who aren't part of the evangelical community can take away lessons. I want to thank you for a couple of theological nuggets that served me well this morning. I've been on this journey for 25 years in Chicago. And it would be these two things, and then I want to ask you to help us think more incisively about a third thing. So the idea that compromise can be an action of self-sacrifice or sacrificial love, I think that's just a wonderful nugget to take away. And our traditions, all of them, call us to grapple with hospitality, grapple with walking with those different than us. As a Baptist, deeply committed to separation of church and state, I've been thinking much about the ethics of non-coercion and what does it mean to be called to offer freedoms to others. The second thing was the not taking responsibility for the well-being of God. What a gift, and I encourage all of us who resonate with that to take that away. So my Wheaton friend, I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Chris.
Chris, sorry, nice to meet you. As one who's come through the evangelical communities and gratefully spent much of my adult life in the mainline communities who are elders in this journey, I've come to really have a lot of passion and sensitivity about the conservative contributions to keeping boundaries, strong leadership, moral formation. And so I think one of the ways that liberal folks in this intra-faith conversation often fail to contribute to the bigger picture is that I think often we have weak contributions to the conversations of leadership, moral formation, and boundary setting, and the right and responsibility for a community to articulate its limits. Yeah. So maybe one or more of you can speak to this question about the positive psychological and spiritual aspect of setting boundaries.
Thank you for, I guess, appreciating things in, is this working? I can't hear. No. Thank you for your kind words. They're very generous. I think I spoke before very briefly about the evangelical sense in which distinctiveness is extremely important to our identity. And I think that is one of the strengths of the movement, is retaining distinctiveness. It could be called even dogmatism in a negative sense, but in that way, identity remains something very clear and something that is even generative, something that the next generation can grab on, it has handles, and carry forward. So that is the place where strong leadership, like you said, I think sort of flows out of. And I guess what people like, the reason why I think we love and call ourselves evangelical is that sense of strength and conviction, and we want to take it to probably differing places, but yeah, and in this interfaith conversation, yeah, I don't know, I would love to see that from all parties and all conversations being distinct yet cooperative, and almost ushering in the encouragement for people to change through I guess almost your actions that sort of speak to your distinct beliefs, rather than talking about your beliefs out of the context of actions. I don't know.
Yeah, I just want to say also for two resources in regards to that. One, I think what Chris is talking about, there's this concept called principled pluralism that's becoming all the rage these days, and I think it's really great because it is that idea that traditional interfaith is typically quite wishy-washy. We come together and we blur the boundaries of what we actually believe, and we try to sing worship songs together about concepts of God that don't, and it just can get messy, and I hope nobody takes that as a strong critique. But one of my mentors, a guy who's speaking later today, who you all should go hear, Brian McLaren, has written a book called Why Did Jesus, Buddha, Moses, and Muhammad Cross the Road? And in this book, he articulates this beautiful vision of principled pluralism, what it looks like to distinctly hold my faith as an evangelical Christian, and yet figure out ways to enter into conversations that are productive and unify all the faith traditions together. And I think that's what we're going to see in the millennial generation in the future. We want a distinct faith. I want a tradition to be a part of. So many millennials didn't grow up with family tradition and religious tradition. We need tradition, but we also want to figure out how to bring that tradition to the table with other traditions and figure out how we can work together to make the world a better place. So I just say that.
We have literally 5 minutes left, so if you want to come, we can jam through these as quickly as possible.
Good morning. So I'm the executive director of the Desmond Tutu Peace Foundation, and previously I worked for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And as most of you probably know, the Archbishop he's very liberal on this topic and very opinionated on this topic. And I learned through his conversations with His Holiness that His Holiness has started to open up on this topic as well. And so my question is, how do we encourage other faith leaders to have this dialogue? How and not just, and it gives me hope because they are so much older and they're from a completely different generation. Right. But how do we encourage them to open up and have this conversation to do that?
I just say it seems that, one, if you're going to get people like Pope Francis, the Dalai Lama, or Desmond Tutu to change their positions, you need someone of the caliber of Pope Francis, the Dalai Lama, or Desmond Tutu to talk to them. And so I think that discussion between Desmond Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama makes sense. I also just think some of these higher up religious leaders, we see this in the Southern Baptist world, they're just not connected to the real world. They're not connected to the actual LGBT people in their congregations. And so I'd go back and say I think the Dalai Lama probably needs some LGBT people around him to share their experience as Buddhist LGBT people. And I think that catalyzes transformation for religious leaders, honestly.
The other thing that I think, I grew up with a dad who is a pastor, so I feel free to say this, they love to talk a lot. Amen. And so I think the antithesis is my answer. If I could encourage religious leaders to do one thing, it's listen. Amen. It's listen, but not just to the words that are coming out of the mouth, but the emotion that's being communicated by that person. Because what we're talking about is not just the way my life looks in this context. I'm talking about the internal reality that I experience. And if religious leaders can become incredibly familiar with my internal reality, we're going to teach them how to understand this very differently. It's going to shift the category that it exists in. We can take one more, and then I think we have to close it up.
Thank you. So I was raised Old Regular Baptist and Southern Baptist, and the Old Regular Baptists think the Southern Baptists are liberals. And I am gay. Currently, I'm an American Baptist seminarian in New England, which is a completely different side of the spectrum. So there are evangelicals and conservative Christians who I love dearly, who are my friends and my family. And same thing for the liberals. I see fundamentalism on both sides, and all fundamentalism annoys me. We get together in a group like this, and we want to be kind and respectful, and I understand that. Like I look at, we were talking about scripturally based traditions where we need to rely on the book. Romans 13, have respect for those in authority. Like, tell that to my grandmother who blames Obama for her flat tires. Yeah. Or like my divorced and remarried uncle who has no problem finding an evangelical church that he can attend, though Jesus was very clear about that. And so there's this point where I look at it and I'm like, okay, yes, there are verses that you could take that way, but there are lots of verses that you ignore. And really what it just sort of seems like is you think this is icky, and here are some verses that back you up. Right. And so I wonder, not all views are equally as valid, and not all views are equally as worthy of respect. Sure. I do not respect people who use the Bible to produce war or slavery or any number of different issues. So at what point do we just say your position is not okay? Right.
So I 100% agree with that. That's beautiful. And there is coming this is going to be hard. Let me know if you want to push back on this. In the evangelical world and in the religious community, the LGBT issue has progressed so quickly. And so that's the only reason right now I'm willing to give so much grace and compassion to the leaders that are struggling to figure out, okay, what do we do with this theologically? Do we just hold the line, or is there a way to view this differently? And I think, again, it changes first through experience, but there's great theological work being done in the Christian tradition to help understand a different way of reading these texts that's faithful and traditional and great. I just think that in this moment, there will come a day soon where we need to be able to say, if you are calling homosexuals an abomination, that's no longer morally acceptable. And I think we're probably getting there quite quickly. I think post-marriage equality, the way that the language that's been spoken is that they're on the wrong side of history, that kind of thing. I think there's some truth to that. However, I also want to have a little bit of grace in just saying, I know as somebody who has 3 years ago not affirming and standing on street corners preaching against LGBT people, that this happens so quickly that I just want to say, if we're going to see productive change in religious communities, we need to give them space to work it out a little bit. But also, if they're advocating for things that are harming people, the grace ends. If you're harming people, if you're advocating for legislation that says LGBT people should be fired for their jobs and be discriminated against, I think that's a moral issue that we can take a hard line on and say, that's not Christian in any regard, and that's wrong. And so that's where I stand on that. Yeah.
I think we're out of time.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you all for coming, and thank you again, these wise men, very young. I feel so old. So thank you so much, and for all of your contributions. And I know that they said they have their business cards and things if you all want to visit after. I think we might have to start moving out to the hall, though, because there might be another session needing to use this room. So thank you all.